I'm sitting here watching one of the most intense football games Saturday night at around midnight. Actually, what time is it? Yeah, coming up on midnight. The Florida State Notre Dame game. Awesome. Anyway, so we're going to be talking about embryonic survival pods, and we've already talked about one of these things in the seed. And if you recall, the flower ultimately leads to the development of the seed, and the seed is tucked inside a fruit. In some cases, it's tucked inside of a fruit. But just be sure that you understand here that the seed is designed to allow the growing embryo to develop properly, otherwise known as germinate, without the ability to be able to undergo photosynthesis. So, what's key here is that this endosperm provides the food in the form of sugars. It starts off as starch, and those starches get broken down through hydrolysis and are then used directly by the embryo to be able to grow itself. And then ultimately the embryo is able to grow above the surface of the soil, produce its own leaves, and start photosynthesis itself. Okay, so the important thing too here is, if you recall, the seed coat is a protective coat, and it protects a seed from numerous things. It could either be that it protects it from, it waterproofs it. It could also protect it from digestive enzymes and acids, so digestion. And it could also protect it from cold. And lastly, strange one that I will talk about, maybe I won't talk about, fire. But understand there are some seeds that actually need to, will only germinate after fire has gone through. So in some sense, the seed coat triggers, when fire hits it, it triggers the seed coat to crack a little bit and germination would start. All right, so without this specialized seed, there's no way any of these plant embryos would survive. Holy cow. Notre Dame just completely got jobbed in that game. Unbelievable. I hate it when the dumb teams like Florida State win and the smart people like Notre Dame lose. It kills me. All right, so let's take a look at another of these embryonic survival pods, and that is the amniotic egg. And keep in mind that the amniotic egg is functionally the same thing as a seed. It's allowing for an embryo to grow, and it's providing all the bits and pieces that are needed for an embryo to be able to grow properly. In the case of an amniotic egg, it could be something like a bird, or it could be an alligator. There are any number of different organisms that use an amniotic egg. And eggs can be incredibly huge, too. Keep in mind that something like an ostrich egg can be about 3.5 pounds, and also it would take 42 days for it to hatch. So we're talking about some crazy cool eggs that exist out there. Okay, so there you go, drying an egg. And then just inside of this, you're going to have a membrane. This is going to look pretty ugly pretty quickly. By the way, obviously this outer thing is the egg shell. And what's cool about egg shells is that they're actually permeable. They're made out of solid calcium carbonate, but they allow oxygen and CO2 to get in and out, despite the fact that they are waterproof. Now, for any of you guys who've ever had a hard-boiled egg, you would know that there's this air cell that exists at the base of an egg, adding some cushioning that exists there. All right, so let's take a look at what we have going on here. Next thing I'm going to draw is a round circular-like thing here, and this is a membrane, or it's a sac that we refer to as the chorion. And inside the chorion, you have 3 additional sacs. So you have one sac here, and another sac here, and then another one right here. So inside this one far over on the left side, I have the actual embryo. There's like a chicken embryo. It looks pretty lousy, but there you go. There's my embryo. And then, and the sac that holds on to the embryo is called the amnion. And in fact, remember that word, amnion. And then we have another sac over here called the allantois. And the allantois is pretty cool because that's where waste products will actually be held. So it's like a sac for holding all the wastes that come out of the process of a growing embryo. And then over on this side, this third sac is called the yolk sac. And you all know the yolk sac. It's that bright yellow thing. It dominates a hard-boiled egg when you eat a hard-boiled egg, or even when you just don't even have to boil it. You know it's this bright yellow sac. And that contains all the nutrients. And in fact, the yolk sac shrinks as the embryo gets bigger. So if you were to look at a fertilized chicken egg in its very early stages post-fertilization, then you would see that it was primarily yolk sac. But if you waited up to 15 days later, you would see the yolk sac would have disappeared, and in its place you'd have the embryo growing. The egg white is mostly made up of water and proteins, and we refer to the egg white as egg white or albumin, which I think means white. I'm not sure about that. Maybe I'm making that up. And it's mostly water that's in there, and it's really to try to buffer any sort of changes in temperature, rapid changes in temperature, which would end up hurting or killing the embryo. And then the last thing I have here, I'm going to show you here, are these thick proteinaceous cord-like things that hold the whole chorion in place. And this is called the chalaza, or there are 2 chalaza that are actually hanging out there. Okay, so it's pretty amazing. This amniotic egg that you see here is an incredibly elegant and efficient method for allowing an embryo to grow, and all it needs is for the parent to be able to incubate it, to keep it warm, so that the embryo can actually do all the rest on its own. So there you go, amniotic egg. And then let's move over here, and we're going to talk about this one is the one we're most familiar with, the placenta. And the placenta is, in some sense, it's like a modified egg that you would find in animals. But obviously, unlike an egg that is laid and left out of the mother and incubated outside of the mother, the placenta incubates the embryo inside the mother, which is very expensive to the mother, costly as heck to the mother. If you think about an embryo growing inside of the womb of a mom, it's essentially a parasite taking the nutrients and health away from the mom. But you have a much higher chance that you're going to have a successful birth if you're walking around and containing the organism in your body. It's easier for the mother to get nutrients and at the same time protect her young if she doesn't have to leave the nest. Okay, so let's take a look at the placenta that we would find in an animal. And let me give it, there we go. Not pretty, but here we go. What I'm drawing right here is the uterus. So when I'm putting these lines here, these black lines, are the walls of the uterus. Okay. And the uterus is a very muscular organ, and ultimately it's going to be used to push the child out when the time comes for the child to be born. And then we have something attached to the wall of the uterus, right over here. And this, in fact, has blood vessels in it that essentially exchange nutrients and gases with the mother's bloodstream. Now, keep in mind, the bloodstream of the mother is independent of the bloodstream of the embryo, but there's a point where the nutrients are exchanged, and I'm just going to draw that sort of in blue here. You could imagine that the mother's bloodstream would come very close to the placenta, exchange all the nutrients, exchange all the wastes as well, and then it would transfer those through the placenta, right? This would be from the mother, and I'm going to show the root. This is coming in from the mother. Notice I changed color on purpose so you would understand it's not a direct line into the child from the mother. And this would then snake out through here and would attach to the growing embryo. Okay, so and we'd add pharyngeal gill slits here, and here's the eyeball, and maybe we'd have the rudimentary notochord being developed here. But very importantly, that umbilical cord attaches to that growing embryo there. So here we have embryo. Oh, I didn't label this. This is the placenta. The placenta is actually, after a mother gives birth to the child, the placenta also has to be pushed out of the mother's womb. So you have to give birth to a placenta. And in some cultures, as scary as this sounds, they actually eat the placenta. And it's a strange thing that you can't imagine would happen very much in the U.S. And then there's my umbilical cord. Actually, it's not my umbilical cord. There is an umbilical cord. And the other thing that I haven't shown you here, and this is very important, is that surrounding this whole thing, the whole thing being the embryo, and right up to the placenta, you would have a sac, not unlike the sac that we saw over here with the egg, okay, surrounding the embryo, right? And that sac is called the amnion. Hold on a second. The amnion? Isn't that what that's called over here? Indeed it is. The same kind of concept here. We have a sac that covers up the embryo, called the amnion. And then the fetus, or the embryo, is hanging out in a solution of mostly water, but a whole bunch of potential wastes and everything might be falling in there, as well as some cells, etc. Okay? So, a pretty cool thing here to think that we have structures that look awfully similar to one another, with going from the seed to the amniotic egg to the placenta that you find in mammals, and they all function in the same way. They serve as survival pods for a growing, developing embryo. And this might be you. Bye.